When Family Guy hit TV screens over 25 years ago, one of the biggest things that separated this animated sitcom from that other sitcom we don't need to name was the family dog, Brian Griffin. Brian was more than a family dog. He used to be Peter's conscience, voice of reason if you will. Brian was witty, intellectual, and occasionally pretty cynical. Oh, and he acted like a, dog. That was the joke. The most sensible member of the family was a canine. Over the next few seasons, Brian had the most character development on the show. We explored his loneliness, his failed relationships, his lofty ambitions as a writer, and his struggle to find meaning in a world where he was both part of the family and still just a dog. Episodes like Brian, Portrait of a Dog, and Brian in Love made him one of the most emotionally complex characters on the show. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Brian started to lose the qualities that made him relatable, and the show lost something along with him. So what happened? How did the once beloved moral compass of Quahog become one of its most despised characters? And could its downfall have signaled a greater decline for Family Guy as a whole? Often, new fans who decide to watch Family Guy from the very beginning are taken aback by just how different the show felt in its first season. And no, I'm not talking about the low-budget animation in the pilot or the fact that the family actually treated Meg like a real person back then. I'm talking about how unrecognizable Brian Griffin was as a character. With the exception of his character design, Brian in those early episodes lacked most of the personality traits we associate with him today. He wasn't the intellectual, snarky, and emotionally complex character we'd come to know in later seasons. Instead, he was mainly a side character, offering advice to the family or playing the role of Peter's conscience when the pilot needed it. This version of Brian was closely tied to the life of Larry and Steve, Seth MacFarlane's earlier animated shorts that served as the prototypes for Family Guy. In these shorts, Larry and his talking dog Steve formed a dynamic that would later evolve into Peter and Brian. Steve, much like Brian, was more intelligent than his human counterpart and often had to bail Larry out of trouble.
Just my luck that the only person who could hear me had the IQ of a flank steak.
While that core concept carried over into Family Guy, Brian's early portrayal in the series lacked the depth that would make him one of the show's most iconic characters. Take the pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow. For example, Brian's role in the story is minimal. He's there to advise Peter against committing welfare fraud.
Hey, how'd she take it?
I told her she was fat.
No.
But his commentary barely scratches the surface of his personality. For most of the season, Brian serves as a support character, chiming in with the occasional quip or helping to move the plot along. He's likable, sure, but far from the fully realized character he'd become later. It wasn't until the season 1 finale, Brian, Portrait of a Dog, that Brian started to come into his own. This episode marked a turning point, giving Brian emotional depth and establishing his inner struggles. The plot follows Brian as he reluctantly agrees to compete in a dog show to help the family buy an air conditioner during a heat wave. However, after being humiliated by Peter during the show, Brian storms off and begins to question his place in the world. The episode dives into heavy themes of inequality, with Brian realizing that despite his intelligence and human-like behavior, he's still treated as a second-class citizen simply because he's a dog. There's a particularly striking scene where Brian is nearly arrested for drinking from a public water fountain, an obvious nod to racial segregation.
Oh, gross. Did he just drink from a fountain?
Hey, you! Stay!
Later, when Brian ends up on death row after being labeled as a dangerous animal, he defends himself in court by referencing Plessy versus Ferguson, a landmark segregation case. Although the council dismisses him with a laugh, the moment underscores Brian's growing frustration with his status in society. While the episode wraps up with a admittedly funny resolution, Peter bribing the council to save Brian, it's the emotional beats that stand out. For the first time, Brian isn't just a background character or a plot device, he's a fully formed individual with complex emotions and a personal journey. This newfound depth gave the writers a foundation to build on, transforming Brian into one of the show's most compelling characters in later seasons. By the end of season 1, Brian had gone from being a side character to someone who could carry an episode on his own. His arc in Portrait of a Dog hinted at the potential for deeper, more meaningful storytelling within the chaotic world of Family Guy. But as we'll see in the next section, this is only the beginning of Brian's evolution and the cracks that would eventually form in his character. By the time Family Guy moved into its second season, Brian Griffin was finally becoming more than just Peter's sarcastic conscience. He was emerging as a character in his own right, with his own flaws, goals, and insecurities. If the first season's Brian, Portrait of a Dog, introduced his potential, season 2 began building on it. Episodes like Brian in Love dug deeper into Brian's psyche, presenting him as someone wrestling with feelings of loneliness and confusion. In this episode, Brian realizes he's in love with Lois, leading to a heartfelt and surprisingly serious moment of self-reflection.
Sometimes we should cherish what we already have, like a very special friendship. Let's say like the one you and I share that Someone like me wouldn't change for anything in the world.
Instead of playing his romantic feelings for laughs, the show allowed Brian to explore them in a way that felt honest and relatable. But even as Brian became more layered, there was always a sense that he wasn't entirely fictional. Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator, has admitted in interviews that Brian is essentially his self-insert. The parallels are hard to miss. Both Seth and Brian are politically liberal, atheist, and jazz-obsessed. Brian's voice, which is simply Seth's speaking voice, only reinforced this connection. Brian kind of became a mouthpiece for Seth's worldview. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing in the show's early days. Brian's episodes often touched on topics that were clearly important to Seth, like inequality or social justice. In You May Now Kiss the, Guy Who Receives, Brian fights for gay marriage rights, even going so far as to hold Mayor Adam West hostage to make his point.
Hey look, Brian's on TV!
And now, some Channel 5 exclusive footage of the crazed homosexual gunman who's taken Mayor West hostage.
I mean, the show can't be serious 100% of the time. Anyways, the episode, which was inspired by Seth's own views, gave Brian a moral center that set him apart from the chaos around him. He wasn't perfect, but he was principled, and in a show as ridiculous as Family Guy, that felt refreshing. These moments also gave the series a surprising sense of balance. Family Guy has always been a show built on absurd cutaways and shock humor, but Brian brought a level of depth that kept the show grounded. This mix of wit, morality, and vulnerability turned Brian into one of the show's most compelling characters in its early seasons. Yet, the steep connection to Seth MacFarlane would later become part of Brian's downfall. As Seth's interest in Family Guy began to fade, so too did Brian's character. But for now, he was the show's heart. Little by little, over the next couple of seasons, Brian's role began to evolve in a way that no one could have predicted. He started off as Peter's companion and occasional moral compass, but it wasn't long before the writers found a new niche for him. His dynamic with Stewie Griffin began to take center stage, transforming Brian from a supporting family member to one of half of the show's most iconic duo. Their partnership officially took shape in Road to Rhode Island, an early Road to episode in season 2. This was an ambitious, self-contained adventure featuring Brian and Stewie on a chaotic journey. Stewie's over-the-top antics were hilariously tempered by Brian's sarcasm, while Brian's emotional moments were given surprising weight thanks to Stewie's uncharacteristic flashes of empathy. For Brian, it was a chance to explore deeper parts of his character, like his abandonment issues and longing for purpose. The success of this episode was undeniable, and it gave the writers a template to revisit. Soon, Brian and Stewie became a recurring pair, headlining the Road to episodes that parodied everything from buddy movies to sci-fi epics. Episodes like Road to Europe and Road to the Multiverse gave us high-concept plots packed with surreal humor, sharp dialogue, and a surprising amount of heart. The creative freedom of these episodes was a highlight for fans, and the chemistry between Brian and Stewie became one of the show's biggest draws.
It's a fake. It's not real.
I thought it'd be best for you to find out on your own, kid.
I feel like such a fool. Don't even look at me.
Hey, come on. You want to get some ice cream?
But the pairing didn't only bring out the best in Family Guy, it also came with some unintended consequences for Brian. The closer he became to Stewie, the more he drifted from his original identity. He stopped acting as Peter's conscience and became Stewie's partner in crime. The once grounded intellectual became tangled in Stewie's absurd schemes, and while that often made for great comedy, it also started to erode Brian's original charm. His dry wit and intellect were still there, but he was now caught up in Stewie's chaotic world. While the Stewie-Brian dynamic is one of the show's most beloved aspects, it's also one of the clearest turning points for Brian's character. What started as a brilliant comedic pairing gradually became a double-edged sword. It gave Family Guy some of its most memorable moments, but it also marked the beginning of Brian's shift from a grounded character to someone far more ridiculous and far less consistent. Funny enough, the Brian and Stewie dynamic gets us to the episode many people think broke Family Guy. In my last video, Every Death in Family Guy, I talked about Brian's death, but let's revisit it. Because that moment marked more than the end of a character, it represented a deeper shift in the series. The episode Life of Brian was a dramatic moment for fans. It also highlighted how disconnected the writers had become from what originally made Family Guy special. Brian's death and replacement with Vinny came across as a calculated shock tactic meant to stir up controversy and drive viewership. This wasn't the kind of clever storytelling or character exploration that had previously made Family Guy stand out. Instead, it left audiences scratching their heads, wondering what had happened to the show's creative spark. At this point, Brian had already become a controversial figure in the series. His pretentiousness and self-serving behavior had alienated a portion of the audience, but fans were still deeply attached to him. His death and the rushed attempt to replace him with Vinny felt like an insult to longtime viewers. Rather than feeling like an organic development for the character, it came across as hollow, a choice meant to grab attention instead of telling a meaningful story. Behind the scenes, this moment symbolized something bigger: Seth MacFarlane's growing distance from Family Guy. By this time, MacFarlane had stepped away from the show's creative process. He had shifted his focus to other projects like Ted and the Orville. With his voice acting being his only regular contribution, the show lost the guiding hand that once had given it purpose and balance. balance. Brian's death almost felt like a metaphor for McFarlane's own departure from the heart of the series, a creative spark extinguished. When Brian returned 2 episodes later, it wasn't a moment of triumph or clever storytelling. Fans had already guessed he'd come back, given the backlash, but instead of feeling like a real resolution, his return only highlighted how little thought went into the storyline. It was a reset button, a moment that told the audience that nothing really mattered anymore. For many fans, this was the point where Family Guy lost its identity entirely. After Brian's death and return, his character didn't exactly change into something entirely unrecognizable, at least not compared to what he'd become in the later seasons. He technically remained the same Brian, but the worst parts of his personality were turned all the way up. The dry wit, moral struggles, and occasional heartfelt moments were drowned out by his ego, pettiness, and relentless self-absorption. And while Brian had always been flawed, the balance was lost. The Brian of the early seasons, who grappled with existential questions and occasionally showed a softer, vulnerable side, was gone. The shift didn't happen in isolation. It mirrored a large transformation in Family Guy as a whole. In its earliest days, the show had some level of grounding. Sure, it always had cutaway gags and absurd moments, but it was still, at its core, a sitcom about a dysfunctional family trying to figure out a life together. Episodes like Portrait of a Dog showed us deeper themes like identity and belonging, using Brian's experiences to reflect real-world struggles. Those moments helped ground the show, even as Peter did something ridiculous or Stewie tried to build his next death ray. But over time, the heart of the show took a backseat to shock humor, random gags, and over-the-top situations. By the time Brian's worst traits were fully embraced, Family Guy itself had become a different beast. Griffins as a family unit weren't the focus anymore. The writers focused more on how many jokes they could get from a premise, which led to tons of inconsistencies in character behavior. Brian, with his overly inflated ego, became a reflection of this shift. Brian used to be the heart of the show, but over time he became a joke. His dream of being a writer became about failure, his beliefs turned into hypocrisy, and his relationships felt fake. In season 1, Brian was the voice of reason, a dog who felt more human than anyone else. Now he's part of the chaos. While glimpses of the old Brian still pop up, he's no longer the character you root for. So has Brian's transformation, and by extension Family Guy's evolution, made the show that bad? It really depends on who you ask. For fans who grew up with the original seasons, particularly the golden age of seasons 1 to 3, the decline feels obvious. But for those who came around in the mid-2000s when the show leaned harder into its absurd humor, seasons 4 to 9 are the gold standard. Then there are the others who actually prefer the newer episodes, finding them sharper than the really dark stretch from seasons 12 to 17. The truth is, Family Guy has always been a show of highs and lows, reinvention and chaos. Seth MacFarlane stepping back after season 10 certainly changed the dynamic, but even now, the show manages to find its moments. Whether it's as good as it once was, that's pretty debatable. However, Brian's transformation mirrors the show's journey. It's messy, funny, and always unpredictable. Speaking of unpredictable things, do you want to know about major deaths in Family Guy? Then don't miss our video on it and see all the twists and fake outs in the show's history.